In the shadowed alleys of 17th century London, where the cobblestones were slick with rain and refuse, another kind of market thrived, one not listed in any merchant's ledger, a market of whispers, quick hands, and desperate bargains. It was here that the female thief lived, not as a villain of legend, but as a woman navigating the narrow, treacherous roads of survival. To understand her world, you must first walk her streets. Imagine a city swollen with people. London's population had doubled since the reign of Elizabeth. The Great Fire had yet to come, and the stink of the Thames clung to every breeze. The poor crowded together in crumbling tenements, sharing lice, hunger, and gossip about better days that never seemed to arrive. For most women, work was a fragile thing. A day's service here, a bit of mending there. Respectability was the only currency they had, and once it was lost, society offered little mercy. The 17th century was an age of dependence. A woman's life was expected to orbit a man, a husband, a father, or an employer. To be without one was to drift in dangerous space. Single women were eyed with suspicion, thought to be idle, immoral, or worse, witches. And so many learned to live on the margins, where morality was flexible and survival depended on wit. In the bustle of the marketplace, women sold fish, thread, apples, second-hand clothes. They were traders, yes, but they were also watchful, alert for opportunity. A loosened purse string, a distracted shopkeeper, a moment when hunger outweighed fear. From these small acts of theft, a ribbon here, a handkerchief there, an entire subculture was born. Beneath the lawful city lay another one, a hidden one. Taverns, alleyways, and lodging houses formed its arteries. Here women could vanish, reinvent themselves, or fall deeper into ruin. London's underworld wasn't divided neatly by gender. Men and women mingled in the same smoky rooms, sharing drink, information, and stolen goods. But make no mistake, life was harder for women. They were often paid less for their loot, scorned by their male partners, and punished more harshly if caught.
And yet, within that hardship, there was a strange sort of freedom. For some women, crime was the only way to escape the endless chain of servitude, the only path that didn't lead back into someone else's control. 17th century England was an unequal land. The upper classes lived off rents and trade, while the poor lived off scraps and luck. There were no safety nets, no welfare, no charity beyond the church. A single illness, a dead husband, a harsh winter, that was all it took to tumble into desperation. For women, the choices were cruelly limited. Domestic service, seamstress work, selling ale, or selling themselves. And when those doors closed, theft became not just a temptation, but a necessity. Many of the women who filled London's prisons and whipping posts were not hardened criminals. They were widows, abandoned wives, or girls who had run away from violent masters. Some had children to feed. Others simply wanted a night's meal or a bit of coin for a bed out of the cold. The law called them thieves, but to themselves they were survivors. Contrary to the moralists' pamphlets, these women were not always solitary pickpockets. Many formed tight-knit groups, small bands of sisters in mischief. In the noisy stalls of Cheapside or the crowded fairs of Southwark, they moved with practiced ease. One might distract a merchant with flattery or complaint, while another slipped a bolt of fabric underneath her cloak. They called it working the market. Men sometimes joined them, husbands, lovers, or bullies, but the most successful crews often ran without them. All female gangs were whispered about by the city watch. They were clever, quick, and unpredictable. Some used disguise, dressing as wealthy gentlewomen to blend into finer crowds. Others played on the expectations of their sex, pretending weakness or modesty to avoid suspicion. To be invisible, they learned, was the greatest weapon of all. What made their world so perilous was not only poverty, but hypocrisy. 17th century England was obsessed with virtue, especially female virtue. Pamphlets preached chastity and obedience, while the same men who wrote them visited brothels and kept mistresses in secret. The city teemed with contradictions, piety and pleasure, order and chaos, charity and cruelty. Women bore the brunt of that double standard. A man who stole was a rogue. A woman who stole was a disgrace to her sex. And yet, in taverns and gossip circles, stories of clever thieving women spread like wildfire. They were both condemned and admired, folk villains who mocked a system stacked against them. The preacher might call them daughters of Eve, but the people in the markets whispered about them with a hint of respect. If London was a stage, then the markets were its daily theater. Women played many roles there: vendor, customer, beggar, and thief. The boundaries between honest trade and petty crime blurred easily. A stolen ribbon could be sold 2 stalls away before the owner even noticed. A washerwoman might wash her employer's linen by day and sell the same linen in a dark alley by night. Survival, after all, has its own sort of morality. The market was more than a place of exchange. It was a pulse, a rhythm of city life. To understand the female thief, one must listen to that rhythm. The clatter of wheels, the calls of vendors, the rustle of skirts, the sudden gasp of a missing coin purse. This was her symphony, her battlefield, her means of resistance. For women, reputation was everything and nothing. A whisper could ruin a life faster than a judge's sentence. Once a woman was labeled light-fingered, doors closed. Employers dismissed her, neighbors shunned her, the parish refused aid. So many simply leaned into the label, became what they were accused of being. In a world where the law offered little mercy, shame became meaningless. You could not eat virtue, after all, and you could not feed your children with honesty. Picture her now. A woman of 20, though life has aged her face beyond that. Her dress is patched and muddy, her fingers deft. She moves through the crowd like smoke, unseen until it's too late. She lifts a kerchief, tucks it into her sleeve, and disappears into the maze of stalls. Tonight, that kerchief might buy bread, or gin, or passage out of town. Tomorrow she may be caught and whipped, or she may vanish into the night again, another nameless figure in London's endless tide. As theft grew common, authorities began to take notice. New laws targeted disorderly women. Watchmen patrolled markets, magistrates filled their dockets, and pamphleteers found an eager audience for tales of female vice. They painted women thieves as unnatural, creatures who had strayed from the path of obedience. But for every sermon written against them, there was another woman on the street, hungry and cold, doing what she must to live. So begins the story of the 17th century female thief, not a tale of evil, but of endurance. She was born of poverty, hemmed in by expectation, and judged by men who never knew hunger. Yet within her shadowed world there flickered a spark of cunning, courage, and defiance. She was not the monster they painted her to be. She was a mirror, reflecting a society that forced its most vulnerable to steal just to survive. And as the market winds down and the candles gutter out, her footsteps fade into history, but her story somehow remains.
In the labyrinth of 17th century London, a city stitched together with alleyways, smoke, and desperation, crime was not always a choice. For many women, it was survival dressed in shadows. These were not master criminals or scheming villains of stage plays. They were daughters, mothers, and widows, each navigating a world that left little room for mercy. Their tools were simple: sharp eyes, nimble fingers, and a heart that beat faster only when caught. To live, they learned to steal, and in their hands, theft became an art form as much as necessity. The marketplace was their stage, bustling, noisy, and perfectly chaotic, the ideal hunting ground. Women worked the crowd with uncanny grace. They moved between stalls like threads through cloth, eyes scanning, hands hidden beneath shawls. Most targeted petty property crimes, the lifting of linen, ribbons, or fine lace, easy to fold and sell before dusk. They didn't steal gold or jewels. They stole what could be sold, traded, or worn. A loaf of bread, a strip of fabric, a set of spoons. Enough to keep a child warm or a stomach full. Each act was calculated and small, but repeated daily, it became a livelihood. Shoplifting was a favorite among women who could pass as customers. A stolen glance at the right moment, a distracted shopkeeper, and a sleeve deep enough to hide a handful of lace. Some worked alone, others in pairs, one woman charming the merchant with flattery or complaint, while another quietly filled her pockets. The act was swift, discreet, and often unnoticed until the day's end. But not all theft required finesse. Some required courage or desperation. One of the most infamous tactics of the era was known as the buttock and file, a phrase whispered in taverns and shouted in courtrooms as if naming it could wash away its shame. In this scheme, a woman would lure a man into a secluded alley or creep joint, a rented room, poorly lit, thick with the smell of ale and danger. Her promise was pleasure, but as soon as the man was distracted, his purse open, his guard down, her accomplice, the file, would emerge from the shadows and relieve him of his belongings. It was a partnership born from poverty and peril. Some women chose it.
Others were coerced into it by lovers or pimps who saw them as bait in a cruel marketplace of flesh and deceit. But whether willing or forced, these women learned one thing well. In a city that preyed on the weak, the only safety was to strike first.
Beyond alleys and markets, another world of crime existed, one of disguise and deception. Some women, more daring or clever, reinvented themselves completely. They studied the manners of gentle women, practiced refined speech, and dressed in borrowed elegance. Wearing fine silk gloves and powdered hair, they mingled in theaters, churches, and public gardens, blending seamlessly with the very class that condemned them. A misplaced glove, a dropped fan, a whispered apology, all it took to pluck a watch or ring unnoticed. Later, these tactics would inspire notorious figures like Jenny Diver, the early 18th century pickpocket, whose cunning and composure turned crime into performance art. But her methods were echoes of the women who came before her, women who learned that in a world obsessed with appearances, disguise was power. While men often led the city's organized thieving rings, women formed their own alliances, sometimes mixed, sometimes all-female. They worked in gangs, bound not by loyalty, but by necessity. In these crews, every woman had her role. The stall to distract, the fumbler to lift the goods, the carrier to disappear with them into the crowd. Some of these gangs operated like families, crude, loud, and occasionally brutal. They looked after one another, shared meals, and even raised each other's children when one was taken by the law. But others were ruled by men, cruel figures who promised protection yet treated their women as expendable tools. It was a life of risk and repetition. Each theft bought a day's peace. Each day carried the chance of the noose. These were not villains of grandeur or wickedness. Their stories were smaller, humbler, more human. Each theft began with hunger. Each scheme with the knowledge that honest work was rare and rarely paid. In an age when women could not vote, own property, or seek fair employment, theft became an act of unspoken rebellion, a grim kind of equality earned in darkness. Still, the city never saw them as survivors, only as symbols of sin. Pamphlets called them temptresses, she-devils, or whores of the market. Cartoon woodcuts mocked their punishment, showing them whipped or chained, faces twisted in shame. But beneath the ink and scorn, a different story lived, one of quiet defiance, of women carving a space in a world that offered them none. There was artistry in their craft, though society refused to call it such. The way they moved, the precision of their timing, the unspoken communication between partners in crime, all of it spoke to discipline and survival instinct. They memorized the rhythm of crowds, the sound of coins clinking in pockets, the soft sigh of opportunity. Each theft was a dance, choreographed not for glory, but for bread. And while some were caught and punished, many faded into anonymity, names never recorded, stories never told. They were ghosts of the city's underbelly, their legacy living on, not in law books, but in the streets they once ruled by instinct alone. So when we speak of female thieves, we should not see only their crimes. We should see the world that made them necessary. A world where survival demanded cunning, where hunger was a sentence and theft a reprieve. These women, seamstresses turned pickpockets, widows turned swindlers, lovers turned accomplices, were not born wicked. They were forged by a society that left them few honest choices. Their stories whisper from the alleys of history still, and if you listen closely, beneath the rain, you can almost hear their footsteps, quick, deliberate, fading into the fog of a city that never forgave them, but never quite forgot them either.
In the world of 17th century crime, love and loyalty were never simple things. They were currency, traded, tested, and often betrayed. For a woman living on the knife edge of poverty, affection could be both her salvation and her undoing. Many of London's female thieves were bound, not just by rope and law, but by men who promised protection and gave only control. A man might take her in when she had nothing, no home, no name, no coin. He'd whisper of partnership, of shared fortune, but soon enough she'd find herself working for his gain, her earnings pocketed, her choices narrowed. Some called them lovers, others called them keepers or pimps. Whatever the name, power never sat evenly between them. Yet the story isn't only one of cruelty. In the shadows of London's taverns and tenements, there were moments of real tenderness, fleeting, fragile, but real. A woman might steal to feed her man, and he might take a beating to protect her from the watch. Such loyalty had its own code, however, rough, and in that world, love was measured by sacrifice, not sentiment. Still, for most, affection was tangled with exploitation. The buttock and file scam, where a woman lured a man into an alley for her accomplice to rob, depended on this very dynamic. The woman took the risk, the man took the profit. Behind every theft was a negotiation of power, of dependence, and sometimes defiance. Some women learned to play the game instead of being played. There were tales of thieves who turned on their handlers, slipping away with the night's takings, vanishing into the labyrinth of London streets. Others formed all-female gangs, breaking the mold entirely. They trusted no man's promise, only each other's grit. For them, crime was not just survival. It was a quiet revolution, an assertion of control in a world that denied them agency. Society saw them as fallen women, seduced, corrupted, ruined. But if you looked closer, the line between victim and rebel blurred. Many of these women were clever, resourceful, and fiercely independent, even as they navigated danger. Their lives were stories of negotiation between love and necessity, safety and freedom. And still, the courts told a simpler story. A woman accused of theft was often described as led astray by a man, a convenient fiction that made her crime less her own and more a reflection of male influence. It was easier for the judges to pity her than to understand her, easier to imagine her a pawn than a player. In truth, most of these women lived somewhere between both roles, both used and using, both trapped and surviving. Love was a risk they could rarely afford, yet it was one they often took.
because in that cold, unforgiving city, even a cruel kind of affection was warmer than none at all.
In the 17th century, justice was not blind. It wore a man's face. When a woman stood before the law, she did not stand as an equal. She stood as a curiosity, an exception, or worse, a temptation. The courtroom became both stage and sermon, where her crimes were weighed not only by law, but by morality, class, and gender. For most women accused of theft, punishment was public and humiliating. Whipping at the cart's tail through the muddy streets, a few days in the pillory, or imprisonment in filthy jails. It was meant not just to correct, but to shame. Society believed that by exposing a woman's sin, it might restore her virtue. Yet, in many cases, women were treated with what the judges called mercy. Mercy, however, was not equality. It was pity, wrapped in condescension. Courts often spared women from the gallows, claiming their weaker natures made them easily led astray by wicked men. But this same reasoning also robbed them of agency. They were punished as sinners, not criminals, and saved not for justice's sake, but to preserve a moral order that kept them dependent. Those who did face death were often the ones who defied the image of feminine submission. A woman who killed her husband, even in defense or desperation, was deemed monstrous. Her crime was not just murder, it was rebellion. To challenge male authority, even in the home, was to challenge the divine chain of command. For such crimes, burning at the stake awaited, a grim reminder of what happened to women who forgot their place. And beyond the courts of theft and blood stood another, more insidious tribunal, that of morality itself. Women were not only tried for what they did, but for who they were. Adulteresses, prostitutes, midwives, and widows, all were suspect. A single woman living independently could be branded as unruly, deceitful, even witch-like. The line between sin and crime blurred until one accusation could serve for both. In witch trials, the theater of judgment reached its cruelest height. Women, often poor, widowed, or outspoken, found themselves accused of consorting with the devil, their poverty seen as proof of evil, their isolation as evidence of guilt. No defense could save them once rumor took root. The law demanded confession, and when it did not come willingly, it was drawn out through pain. Yet even within this darkness, some women resisted. In the dark, they spoke not as victims, but as voices. Their defiance was small, but unforgettable. A refusal to be defined by the men who judged them. And though the law rarely bent in their favor, their words survived in the records. I stole because I was hungry. A sentence as simple as it was revolutionary. To the men of the court, justice was an order to be preserved. To the women who stood before it, justice was something still waiting to be born.
The gallows, that grim stage where countless stories met their final breath. But history, my dear listener, has a way of whispering beyond the rope. Many of the women we've spoken of, thieves, midwives, beggars, and rebels, did not fade quietly into oblivion. No, their voices, though bound in silence, have found curious ways to survive. through court records, broadsheets, and even the gossip of taverns. Fragments of their courage linger like smoke after the fire's gone cold. You see, in a world where women were expected to obey, to remain unseen unless serving or suffering, even crime could become a strange, desperate form of expression. A stolen loaf of bread was not merely hunger, it was defiance. A whispered charm or healing touch might not be witchcraft, but knowledge passed through generations, hidden in plain sight. And yet, the price of survival was steep. Society demanded order, and order demanded punishment. These women, heavy with both labor and judgment, bore the weight of their choices upon their backs and their names. To steal was to sin. To speak out was to invite suspicion. To act was to threaten the fragile peace of patriarchy itself. Still, some of them found agency even as the noose tightened. Imagine a condemned woman on the scaffold, lifting her voice not in tears but in testimony. She declares her innocence or confesses with such dignity that her words echo through the crowd. In that moment, she is not merely the accused, she becomes the storyteller, the historian of her own brief, burning life. Their memories did not die with them. Centuries later, scholars and artists, much like us today, search through faded ink and brittle parchment, piecing together what the law tried to erase. And with every discovery, another voice returns. Another truth is remembered. When we listen closely, we hear not only their crimes, but their conditions. Poverty that pushed them, laws that silenced them, a hunger for bread, for freedom, for a voice that could not be contained by the world they lived in. So perhaps the gallows were not only an end, perhaps they were a beginning, a monument to survival in its rawest form. Because every story we unearth reminds us that history is not written by the powerful alone, but by those who dared to live, even when the world told them not to. And so, we remember them, not as victims, but as voices, still speaking from the shadows of history.